guys, and welcome back to another episode of the New Customer Machine podcast. I'm excited that you're back, and I'm excited to introduce you to today's guest, Michael Mills. Michael is one of the managing directors of Business Design Corporation, a business development company for small and mid-sized businesses. The Business Design Corporation develops and implements technology, specifically the Touchstone business system, that transforms businesses into more scalable and more satisfying enterprises with 100% more value, more freedom, more balance, more profit, and more satisfaction. Now, if that doesn't sound exciting enough, I've got 3 pages of notes here from my in-depth conversation with Michael, all focused on systematizing and scaling the sales process. Now, this is a challenge that many of my peers struggle with. Many business owners, whether they're my clients, they're people I know from the Entrepreneurs Organization, or other people that I network with, they all tend to struggle when it comes to systematizing and delegating and scaling the sales function. And so Michael is a complete expert on that, and we talk all about the ways that every company can do that. So this conversation was really in-depth, and like I said, I've got 3 pages of notes to go over some really exciting things that I think you're going to want to know. Things like the difference between heads up and heads down employees and why every company needs both. I remember Michael shared this trick that will actually get your team to follow the processes. You know, it's something a lot of us struggle with. We design these processes, we hand them off to our employees, and we wonder why nobody does anything consistently. And so Michael actually walked us through the trick to prevent that from happening. Michael talked about how he likes to avoid hiring prima donnas and the right kinds of people to hire. He walks us through how any company can break down their sales and marketing functions into these tight little processes that can be taught to anybody, no matter what kind of business you have. I think it's the absolute gem of this podcast. We went into why every company should have complete functional accountability, what that is, and how to do that. He even shares the story of how a very successful artist has used these exact concepts to scale his craft. The point is, if an artist can do this, you can do this with your business. So make sure that you download the free ebook that Michael offered to our listeners if you've ever struggled with any of these concepts. The link is in the show notes. I've taken a look at it myself, and it's got some great content. And I can tell you that many of my friends and my peers are using the Touchstone business system and are getting great results from it. So let's jump right into my conversation with Michael when he was calling in from Santa Rosa, California. Michael, thanks for being here today.
Thank you for having me, Jeremy. Really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Well, I was referred to you as a guest as well as to your firm by a past guest, Scott Fritz. He had some great things to say about you, and then after having spoken with Scott, I spoke to some of his clients who are my friends, and it seems like I have a lot of connections to you.
Yeah, we do. Scott's a great man. Great book, The 40-Hour Work Year. I refer it to all my clients.
Yeah, absolutely. He had a lot of great stories to share on the podcast.
Mm-hmm.
Interestingly enough, you know, when you talk to someone like Scott and you read his material, you know, and I've been a student of entrepreneurship and business for a long time, and, you know, you kind of keep coming across the same themes, right? Very first business book I ever read, someone gave it to me when I was probably 17, 18 years old, and that was The E-Myth Revisited, which is the best-selling book of all time. And you have a connection with The E-Myth, right?
Yes, we do. My company, many years ago, my company was a group of master certified E-Myth consultants. We delivered Michael's E-Myth Mastery program to many hundreds of entrepreneurs.
Excellent. And so that really brings us to that theme that I keep coming across. You know, every time I talk to mentors or I interview other entrepreneurs who've had success, they always include this idea, this discipline to get things on paper, you know, to get it out of your head, get yourself out of the process and turn it from this chaotic, you know, I'm an expert and I just have this intuition and I know how to sell or I know how to, you know, do everything. It always comes down to you can't scale it if you can't get it on paper. And it seems like you've kind of built your whole organization around that idea, right?
You know, Jeremy, when we were delivering the Mastery program, we found it to be very good, yet very theoretical. In fact, it was great theory, but and if you read Michael's book, The E-Myth Revisited, it's a great argument for getting processes documented, but he doesn't say how. And even back when we were delivering the mastery program, we would deliver all this really good theory, but after 12, 16, 24 months, our clients wouldn't have processes documented. They wouldn't have job descriptions implemented. And so we just thought, this is crazy. This is the foundation of the whole E-Myth book and program. So we just focused on that, how to make things tactical. So what we sort of position ourselves is how to make E-Myth theory practical, how to actually make it happen in your business.
Excellent. Yeah, it's funny. I remember that. I remember it wasn't necessarily the E-Myth, but some other book, the fifth time that I was being told that you have to systematize all this, and it's all about standard operating procedures. I started thinking, well, there's got to be a book on how to do that, right? Like, it was blank canvas syndrome. I was like, where do I start?
Right.
And so it's amazing, and that really kind of brings me to maybe answering the first question that I want to ask is that, given how much there is out there about how important this whole, documentation and systemization and getting an operational, consistent plan on paper, why is it that you think so many businesses resist ever doing this, and that your clients were 18 months into a paid engagement and they're all on board and you still don't have any processes?
Well, let's start with sales processes, because sales processes can be super challenging, but it's because of who's writing them and who's following them. I mean, salespeople are they're not very good with structure and directions. Salespeople are what I call heads-up employees versus heads-down employees. Salespeople, they think on their feet, they're spontaneous, they're creative, and as a result, they can be pretty good at winging it, but they're not very good at following directions. And what we don't really want in a process-dependent business is people winging it. So heads-down employees, on the other hand, they're detail-oriented. They could be bookkeepers, they might be architects, they might be engineers, they could be Navy SEALs. And I sort of say that tongue-in-cheek, but I've actually had a Navy SEAL, an ex-Navy SEAL, as a client, and he needed no help at all. He just nailed it. But these heads-down employees they're a better fit for process and structure. So salespeople, these heads-up employees, they tend to think that what they do can't be systemized. And when you tell them to follow direction, when you try to get them into structure, they tell you that they can't or they won't because they don't think it's going to work for them. But that said, it's not just the processes for acquiring new clients that businesses tend to resist, Jeremy. It can be challenging to get any processes written. We were just talking about this. Entrepreneurs get so excited about process implementation when they read one of these books on the topic, like the E-Myth, or another great book that we should mention. It's a great book. It's by a guy named John Warillo, and it's called Built to Sell. Great book. So these entrepreneurs, they read these books, they speak with the consultant, they get all excited about documented processes. And a big mistake that we see is entrepreneurs fail to enroll their employees in helping them systemize their business. You simply can't do it on your own. You need your people to be involved. But what happens is the business owner starts to understand the value of organization, the value of consistency, the value of effective delegation. They read about it. They talk with their peers about it. They talk with their mentors and maybe a consultant about it, and they get all excited because they understand the value of process implementation. They get the context. This is a really key word. They understand the context. And then they walk down the hall and they ask their sales manager or their sales team, write down everything you do. Well, without the context and understanding, what do you think the sales team is thinking?
You're going to replace me.
Yeah, you're going to fire me. Or they're thinking, oh, yeah, right. I'm already working 50 hours a week. You're only paying me for 40. Or they're going to say, what's in it for me? Why should I do this? And still others, they're going to roll their eyes, right? And they're going to say, well, here comes the next big idea of the month, because the business owner probably never carries through on any of these great ideas. So what we pretty much talk about all the time is you got to enroll your team in this step. You need the time to teach them the value and the importance, how it's going to make their job easier, how it's going to make them more money, how it's going to give them more balance, more satisfaction, less frustration in their work environment. It's important to remember that it's simply human nature to think, what's in it for me? And if your people can get to that place, you'll create this culture of organization um, and valuing processes, and it's really key.
That's huge. It's funny as you say that. I've read Built to Sell many times, and I just think there's so much wisdom in there. When you read that book and it's a parable, he has his sales team literally updating the playbook, on a regular basis. What's working, what's not, how can you add to that? And he was effectively leading the process, but not necessarily filling in all the blanks himself. And I think that can be easily overlooked, especially when so many of us as entrepreneurs are, we have superhero syndrome, and we want to jump in, we can solve it all, no one can do it as good as me. But as Scott mentioned on his podcast, if you can find someone that can do it 70% as good as you, then it's probably enough, and it's better than it taking all of your time, right?
Yeah, it's the good enough syndrome, I like to call it.
Yeah.
If they can do it good enough, nobody knows how great you can do it, and you can't even expect people to do it as well as you can do it. You just have to get it done well enough, and if you've got great process, people can achieve those expectations.
Yeah, that's huge. That reminds me of something that really stuck with me, that I use when I'm talking to some of my peers who I can see have a hard time letting go. And it's a Jack Welch quote that I love. And he said, in all of my companies, there's never been a better salesperson than me, but I still can't sell as much as 10 salespeople. And it was all about just, scaling and delegating that and trusting the team.
Mm-hmm. We had an example. I had a client who was an energy consultant, and he'd owned his business for 19 years. I mean, he was amazing. If you gave him a lead, 90% of the leads you gave him, he could close. I mean, he was fantastic. When we started working on his sales processes, we had to change this because there's no way that another salesperson is going to be able to convert 90% of their leads. So when we started working on this, I can't remember the actual figure, but his fee or cost for generating a lead, let's just say it was $1,000. But he could do that because he only lost 1 out of 10. But when I said, okay, you should be estimating that you're going to get about 30%, 3 out of 10, he suddenly just choked. And he said, well, we can't do that. And I said, no, what we have to do is create processes that you can count on that convert 30% of your leads. We just have to get way more leads at a way cheaper price. And that's what we did because his salespeople didn't have 17 or 19 years of experience, and they didn't say owner on the business card, and they couldn't just give away any deal to get the deal. And so it was a huge epiphany for him.
Yeah, that's something that I had to go through that learning curve, and I think a lot of listeners need to understand that if you're judging your salespeople by your own personal yardstick, what you're able to convert, then you really have to be giving them the same latitude that you give yourself. As the business owner, it's very easy to make concessions on the spot and to change things. And if you're not letting your people do that, then don't expect them to be closing the same amount that you close.
Or if you follow a process. And so this is where we take it to another interesting level with the business owner who's a salesperson. What I typically recommend is that the salesperson write their process down and follow it. Don't divert, because if you write your process down such that it can be followed with scripts and follow-up emails and all of the little intricacies, and salespeople will tell me, well, I don't have a process. And I will say, yes, you do. If I was a fly on the wall, I'd be able to nail it for you, and I could show you, right? Just let me listen to 2 or 3 of your sales conversations, and I'll show you the process. Well, if the business owner actually follows that process, if they're following it consistently, they'll be able to monitor and track what their success rate is, and they should actually be able to expect something very close to that from anybody they hire, as long as whoever they hire follows those processes. But if the business owner does it consistently, he should be able to expect that.
that you clarify that we're talking about the sales and marketing processes, or specifically the sales process is really what you focused on. Because again, we're trying to scale that entire process, and I think that there's this general idea that accounting can be consistent, project management can be consistent. It's expected to be consistent, but sales is this art, and you have to hire the best salespeople who are like these lone horsemen that come in. You just stay out of their way and just let them go. And I think a lot of that is perpetuated by those types of people coming into an organization, and the sale. If the entrepreneur in the company is not a salesperson, they feel very shut out. They feel like they don't know what to do. And if this guy Bob can come in and keep selling, then I don't need to disturb that. I can just stay out of his way. But that can't be scaled, right? So do you have any advice for someone who isn't doing the selling themselves on how they can get a documented sales process?
Yeah, that's a good question. So first of all, let me speak to the fact of hiring salespeople. When you hire salespeople, or when you hire anybody in your organization that is highly skilled, they tend to be prima donnas, and they're very difficult to manage. On the other hand, if you hire someone who isn't as skilled, who's a little greener, they're more manageable, and you can actually get them to follow processes, and you can train them and manage them. It's a very big difference here. I tend to encourage people not to hire prima donnas. But if you think about the sales process, coming back to your question about if I'm not a salesperson, how do I get my sales processes created? The sales is an art form, but it's also a science. In fact, I did a whole webinar on this, but let's break it down. So essentially what you've got in selling is you've got this big giant, I hate this metaphor, but like that, what's that metaphor? How do you eat an elephant one bite at a time or something like that? It's sort of a gross, it's a gross metaphor. How do you eat an elephant? But if you think about the sales process, it is this big elephant. We call it a big key function, and it's a key function in any business. It's this large collection of different processes, and it needs to be broken down. It's just too big a concept to not break down. So even if I'm not a salesperson, I can understand the science or the technology of selling. So in this big key function called sales, there are 4 sub-functions or 4 different categories. There's what is really the strategic side of the selling process, which is really understanding and defining your target markets. This is all about defining who your ideal clients are and understanding what makes them buy, what is their pain. And there's no actual tactical selling at this point. It's just research. Then there's what we call lead generation, or advertising, really. How do you get people to call you? How do you generate leads? How do you get people to call who will actually accept your call? And then there is lead conversion, or rather qualifying and nurturing a lead to a sale. And then finally, there's what we might call client reconversion or client retention. How do you maintain your clients, or how do you get them to buy more from you again and again, as well as referring you to their colleagues, your future qualified prospects. So you sort of break this down. And can I keep going? Can I keep taking you through the science of this, Jeremy? Because you don't have to be a salesperson to do this.
I love it. This is gold. Keep going.
Okay, so what I recommend is the best place to start is simply by mapping out or naming the processes in your organization's sales key function. So in this step, we're not asking how you do it. We're simply asking, what is it that you do? If you've got a business, you've got to be generating leads. There's got to be something happening that's getting the business for you, because if not, you don't have a business. So there's got to be something happening. So we just want to, at this point, we want to map out what is happening. The how is going to come later. And to do that, let's just talk about sales. You want to ask this question. What happens in our company that tells us absolutely that a prospect has become a client? So what is it that happened, and now we know this is a client? because this is going to help you focus on your selling processes, and you won't get lost in the myriad of other processes in the business. I mean, everything that happens up to this point, whatever it is, can be considered part of your sales key function. So in my company, for example, a prospect becomes a client when they register for a free trial of our software. Everything that happens after they register is no longer part of the sales key function. So at this point, I can just let that go. I'm thinking about identifying my sales processes. If something happens after they've registered for their subscription, well, I consider that outside of my sales function. And that's going to be in one of the other functions like client fulfillment or finance or administration or management or strategy, whatever it is. So what happens when we answer this question is we can now focus on our sales processes. So now that we're focused on our sales process, you want to go down a level deeper. And the next question is, at what point does lead generation stop and lead conversion start? This is one of the things we always did in eMyth Mastery. At what point does lead generation stop and lead conversion start? So now we're doing something similar, like focusing on sales, except we're going a little bit deeper. Now our focus is just on lead generation processes. And it's really important that you dissect your sales key function into these categories so that you can really understand the different processes that you have. And so you can more effectively track key indicators for each of these areas. To know how effectively your organization is generating leads, you need to know how many leads your lead generation processes are generating. And that might sound like I'm completely oversimplifying it, but watch as we follow it through. So after lead generation comes what we like to call lead conversion, or nurturing these leads through to a sale. You need to know how well your lead conversion processes are converting leads into sales. What percentage of those leads generated in the lead generation processes become new clients as a result of consistent lead conversion processes. So again, in our company, as an example, once a prospect or a lead has registered for a demo, we are moving out of lead generation and moving into lead conversion. And I can tell you that if we put a person into a demo of our software, 50% of them will become clients. But that's because I'm focusing on these steps from when they register for a demo to when they become a new client. And there are all sorts of processes that happen from point A to point B. So lead generation, let's back up to what happens to get someone to the demo. Some sample processes are going to be like an active referral process, going out to your really good clients and asking for referrals. Or maybe you have processes for advertising on Facebook. You had a podcast with a gentleman who was doing Facebook advertising recently, or Google AdWords. These are lead generation processes. So maybe you do direct mailings. This is coming back. It's quite remarkable with the plethora of email out there. Direct mailings, creative direct mailings are really starting to come back. Or maybe you have inbound marketing or outbound marketing. But you can see how these are all processes that are focused on generating leads. And remember, if I start naming processes that happen after a demo, I'm starting to identify processes in a different category, and I don't want to go there yet. So now I can track which lead sources are producing the most qualified leads at the best price. So then that first question is, at what point does lead generation stop and lead conversion start? This is going to help us identify all of the processes that that help us generate leads. The next question you ask is, once lead conversion starts, in our case, someone registers for a demo, what do we do to get that prospect to make a purchase? And now our focus is on lead conversion. And again, in our company, for example, as we just described a moment ago, lead generation stops and lead conversion starts when someone registers for a demo of our process implementation tool. And lead conversion processes typically include some sort of a qualification call or a qualification process. Might take the form of an initial telephone call or a site visit a free consultation if you're a lawyer, field measurements if you're a contractor. But now we can look at those processes and we can determine what percentage of our leads are actually converting into clients and how long it takes to do that. So it's very scientific. Yes, it's an art form, but it's very scientific. And even artists, they can be spontaneous, but an artist often will work in a structure. There's a guy. Are you familiar with the artist Chihuly? He's out of Washington. He's a glass blower. Have you ever heard of this guy?
I sure have. I believe my aunt is a big fan.
Yeah. Well, this guy doesn't do much of his own artwork anymore. He's got minions that produce all of his stuff. If you go online and look at his videos, he's not even blowing glass anymore. He's got all these processes, and he's trained his these minions to manufacture his stuff, and he puts his name on it. So there's an actual artist who's following a process. So it's very scientific. Even though it's considered an art form, it's very scientific. And I've just tapped on that here.
That was huge. I really appreciate you going through that. For the entrepreneurs who are listening to this that get lost in this abstract idea that sales and marketing is just this thing, and they don't really zoom in and compartmentalize it, isolate what they're trying to do. What are the milestones that you have to get through, even when there's variance, even when you're comparing apples to oranges, like a lead that you get from a referral versus a lead that you get from a direct mail campaign. Those two incoming leads are still going through the same milestone. When they're moving from the lead generation process to the lead conversion process. And I think that as a person who sells marketing services, I'm baffled by the wide disparity of sophistication when it comes to potential clients who call in, and the ones that really understand, are we having a conversation about how to generate leads, or are we talking about converting, are we nurturing them along the way, versus what I think is a huge handicap, which is this idea that, I spend $1, I need to make $1.25, and I don't want to zoom in and understand that that's actually, there's a lot of work going on in there. There's a lot of different things that are happening. There's sub-processes that are really adding up to make one process. And I really not only want to thank you for saying that in a way that was very eloquent, but I feel like you potentially wrote a chapter of the book for me because that is a big theme of New Customer Machine, is that, when you are trying to invest in like a lead nurturing technology, marketing automation software, I know, Michael, you have a lot of experience with, which one was it that you were using? We were talking before the call. It was Infusionsoft, correct? Yeah, exactly. So, HubSpot, any of these tools that everybody is adopting, they rely on you understanding your sales process in detail. And good sales management relies on that as well. It's amazing the difference of the quality of your conversation when you're talking to your salespeople and you sit down on Monday morning and you say, how are we doing? How's your pipeline, right? That's very meaningless compared to how many leads did we generate, how many have moved from the early stage to the late stage. The more specific you get with your buckets as you're watching them move through, the better grip you have on your pipeline.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's so important because so often salespeople leave so much opportunity on the table because of lack of follow-up. They go for this low-hanging fruit and they just throw everything else away. I mean, during the sales process, and there's tons that has been written on this, about 1% of your qualified prospects are going to make a buying decision quickly. So this is the percentage that is ready to buy what you've got right now. They know they need it and they're ready. And in most cases, your salesperson just got lucky. He's happened to be in the right place at the right time. But that means that 99% of your qualified leads, all of these leads that your business is spending money to generate, they either need to think about it, or while they know they have a need, they're not ready to buy, or they don't even know they need what you have to offer them. So this automated short-term and an automated long-term nurturing process, and this is all controlled by software like Infusionsoft or Salesforce, you've got to have those. But these processes have to be documented as well, Jeremy. I mean, if you've ever worked in Infusionsoft, it's a very flexible application. But if you haven't taught, if you don't have the instructions on what to do, which campaigns to put these people in, which flags to flip, how to move them from this pipeline to the next stage, well, then that automation isn't going to run. And you won't even know it's not running. And the person's going to say, well, I didn't know I had to do that. And you can actually say, well, how can you not know this? So this has to be written down as well. And that's a process.
Absolutely. So I know that you went in detail about how to do that, and you definitely gave us some insight. But for an entrepreneur, a company, even a sales manager who's kind of flying by the seat of their pants and they're finding success, what's the first step? Where do I start? If you sit down with a client or you were spelling this out for somebody, what does day one look like so that I can make this a little bit more manageable to document my sales process?
Yeah. So, well, without saying it again, we could just practically rewind what I just said, and that's what I would typically recommend is don't worry about writing how to do it yet. Let's just map it all out. But I just went through that. So let's say it's a slightly different issue. So that's how I typically recommend a business owner get started in systemizing their business. They just name their processes, and they start with the sales and marketing function, and they break it down into that scientific method that just chop it all down into really understandable hunks. But occasionally there are other issues at hand that might lead us in another direction. For example, let's say you're just about to hire a new salesperson. Well, I'd recommend that you focus on identifying and documenting all of the processes that someone in that position is going to be held accountable to. So this way, as soon as they start, I can use the processes that I've documented to train them, to manage them, and to evaluate them. And I can hold them accountable to the expectations I have of them because I've delivered to them the very instructions they need to succeed. If they follow the system, they will be able to achieve what I expect of them. If they aren't achieving expectation, well, chances are they're not following the processes that we documented for them. Another situation, there may be some things that the business owner just wants to delegate. Maybe it just doesn't make much sense for them to do what it is that they're doing because it's a waste of their time. We see this with entrepreneurs who are doing their own invoicing and bookkeeping. I mean, it's just not a good use of their time. They could be out doing these huge, big dollar deals, but they're frittering away their time getting invoices out and paying the bills. And they could subcontract these tasks to someone else at a pay rate of, $20, $25 an hour. And they don't because they feel like they're going to lose control. And they could. But if they create the processes, and all they have to do is pay attention to what it is that they're doing a couple of times as they go through their accounting system with the intention of writing it down, and then they've got the documented process and they can train someone. And then there's one last thing, and I'll give you an example of this. Maybe there's something that you just can't get to. So I personally had an example of this. We have prospects all over the world. We've got prospects in the UK, in Australia, New Zealand, India, South Africa, all over the United States and Canada. Pretty much everywhere they speak English. And it's pretty remarkable because entrepreneurs are worldwide. So prospects would find and download our ebook. We have an ebook on how to systemize your business that's available to anybody who's listening to this, and we can maybe give them a link to get to that later. But it's this ebook that people find on the web, and that would initiate an automated email follow-up process in Infusionsoft. But I'm sort of an old-fashioned sales guy, and I want to actually talk to these prospects. I want to find out what their issues are. I want to know why were they looking for a book on process implementation. And I actually enjoy this relationship building process. But it was super difficult for me to get these telephone meetings on my calendar. I mean, you know what it's like to try to contact someone by telephone. You have to leave a message, and then you schedule a time to try again. And with all of these time zone differences, I mean, the UK, Australia, New Zealand, India, I just had no opportunity to catch these people. unless I wanted to be working at 4 in the morning or 8 at night, and it just wasn't getting done. It was so super frustrating. And we have a saying that if if uh, if you have a frustration in your business, the very first question you should ask is, do we have a process for this? That if we did, we wouldn't have the frustration. Well, in our case, we actually did have a process, but the person responsible for following through on the process, which was me, by the way, wasn't able to get it done well enough. So we decided to hire someone who could focus just on that, just on the process of following up leads who found us on the web and downloaded our ebook, and qualify them, and then schedule them into a first appointment call in my calendar. Because I can tell you that if they get on my calendar, I'm going to have that meeting. So we created this new position, and I went to work on creating the processes for that new position. And you know, I really doubled down. It during the 2 or 3 weeks that it took to find and onboard that new employee, I probably spent about 10 hours getting all of the processes written, and there weren't very many. There were maybe 6. But when I hired, her name is Marie. When I hired Marie, I used the processes to train and manage her. And we hired her part-time, 4 hours a day, 5 days a week. She's in the Philippines, by the way, so it's all cloud-based. I trained her 1 hour a day for 5 days. That's all it took, 5 hours of training. And after in that 1 hour, I would review a process. I'd go through it step by step. I'd make sure she understood it. And then I'd give her the rest of the day, or the rest of the half day, to review what I trained her on, and to learn it, to learn the scripts, and to understand how to find the contacts that needed following up, and what emails to use after leaving a message. So it took about 5 hours of training, and in her second week, I just said, well, let's get started. Start making some calls. She booked 40% of the business owners she spoke to in her first week. She booked them onto my calendar. I mean, she filled up my month with opportunities. It was a huge success. 5 hours of training. So, you know, I still recommend that you start with this very structured process of naming your systems, but the other situations happen. So if you're about to hire a salesperson, double down on that. If you've got some processes that you want to delegate, double down on those. That's typically what I recommend.
That was fantastic. I made a number of notes to kind of circle back and crystallize things that you said that I loved, and at the end of the day, this person, Maria, was it Marie? Maria.
Marie. Yeah.
She made you more effective. You know that it's a high value use of your time to be speaking to these people who have raised their hand and demonstrated interest. It is a less effective or less valuable use of your time to be leaving voicemails and tracking people down, right? And so I really crystallized what you said earlier, which is how much opportunity salespeople lose because of how much follow-up is involved. So one of the arguments that I always make to my clients, and when I'm talking about this, is that a highly trained, seasoned, effective salesperson, which very often is the business owner, is really one of your most valuable assets. And if you can just find a way to transform more of their time into doing the things that make you money, you will transform your business. And so I love that. And I also want to say that in a certain way, you understood that there was a difference between lead gen and lead conversion. And so you said, well, I need to be spending more of my time on lead conversion. Again, I'm paraphrasing here, correct me if I'm wrong. And by having somebody like Marie, you were just delegating a significant portion of one of probably many of your lead gen strategies, which is, how do I get someone who raised their hand, who may or may not be interested, may or may not be qualified, and how do I inject a process, a person there to qualify them and book them and get me more of the right opportunity meetings. Is that really what's happening there?
Exactly. And she doesn't need to be a skilled consultant to do that. If you looked at the scripts, I've literally got scripts that I trained her in, and they're very simple. And it doesn't sound like she's reading them when she follows them. It would be simply like, hi, Jeremy, this is Marie calling from Business Design Corporation. I'm just following up the download that you got of our ebook on how to systemize your business. Just wanted to make sure you got it, and did you have any questions? and you're going to say, "Oh yeah, I got it. I haven't really read it yet, but because you probably hadn't."
Mm-hmm.
And then she's going to say, "Well, one of the founders of our company, he's Michael Mills. He's really interested in why you downloaded it, and he'd love to speak to you. Can we schedule a time for that to happen?" And it doesn't matter what you said at that point, Jeremy. If you said, "Well, what are we going to talk about?" She would say, "Well, you'll talk about your interest in processes, but that will really become part of your conversation with Michael." She doesn't need to know how to systemize a business. She doesn't need to be a salesperson. She doesn't need to be a consultant. 5 hours of training. That's all it took.
It's brilliant. Not only is it brilliant to outsource that, but I think it's really one of those strategic decisions to follow up on an ebook download with a voicemail. I mean, I'm sorry, with an actual voice call. So few people are doing that. It's the whole effective versus efficient conversation. It's much more efficient just to send an email, but you're probably going to be much less effective at booking meetings for Michael, which is the goal. So
Yeah.
I want to point that out. Sometimes the biggest breakthroughs in marketing is to just do the opposite of what everybody else is doing. And I can assure you that almost everyone else is just sending email follow-ups and not actually making phone calls. So it's amazing.
And we do email follow-ups as well with lots of good content. But every time they get an email and then Marie reaches them again, I can absolutely tell you they know who I am. So Marie doesn't have to say, "Well, I'm calling for Michael Mills," because they absolutely know who I am, because they've started to listen to my videos. They've read some of my outbound material. We're always giving them really good and valuable content. But the goal is to get them into a demo. Once we get them into a demo, there's a very good chance that they will become a subscriber.
That's amazing. And one more thing that I want to point out is that, and I know this from having had a demo of the Touchstone Business System, your product, which is designed to help companies do this, you pointed out to me that every process needs to be assigned to somebody on the org chart. And I just want to point out how seemingly intuitive that is, yet still surprising for me. I feel like as entrepreneurs, we have a problem, everyone's kind of doing it, and you say, well, hey, we need to write this down. We keep doing this, we keep solving this problem. Somebody put that in a system. And I really thought it was wise to actually say, well, who's going to do this, right? Because if you don't know who's going to do it, then you pretty much end up with what we had with a lot of our processes, which is a really well done document somewhere in Google Docs that nobody knows about, and nobody every time we hire somebody new, nobody knows it exists. You know what I mean?
Right.
And so I don't know if you want to expand on that, but I really thought that was fascinating that you were really encouraging to make sure every process was tied to a job function, which even as I say it seems so obvious, but clearly it was lost on us.
Well, it's what makes the Touchstone Business System unique, because what Touchstone is not is a simple document sharing application. Google Docs, Dropbox, Microsoft Word, and most of the applications out there that tout themselves as process implementation tools are really just document sharing applications. And a process is always so much more complex than just a document. Because what if you have this is how you locate the lead, this is what you want to say, this is the script, here's an audio example of how it should be or how it could be, here's the spreadsheet where you're going to track your calls. There are all these different elements that are all part of the process. And so they can all be organized within a process name and Touchstone. And then it gets linked to a position on your organizational chart, so you have complete functional accountability. That's a key word there, Jeremy. Complete functional accountability. Here are all of my processes, and here are all of my positions, and now I've linked them all to those positions. So if anything goes wrong, I can just say, well, who's responsible for this process? And it's the sales manager. Well, who's our sales manager? It's Michael. Well, let's go talk to Michael and get it fixed. And if you have hundreds and hundreds of processes, and I will tell you that if after you've been working on systemizing your company, you will have hundreds and hundreds of processes. But if you have a position on your org chart, like Marie, she's got 15 processes. So she doesn't have to sift through hundreds of processes to find what she needs to do. She just clicks on her position on the organizational chart, and everything she needs is right there. It's all right there. Those 15 processes with all of their scripts, all of the videos, all of the audios, all of the tools that she needs, they're all right there, all organized under 15 process names, and that's it. That's all I have to train her on. That's all she needs to think about right there. So it's always at her fingertips.
That is great, and I appreciate you pointing out that there is no necessarily one format or one media that works for every type of process. We talked about. I know you and I are both advocates of checklists. I think they're huge, but for some things, a checklist won't be enough. And you need documents and worksheets and audio files, and that it's really kind of a skill in itself to be able to accurately define a process so that other people can follow it. And I can say from experience, it's one of those skills that you get better at the more you do it, and it starts to become very intuitive. At least it was for me. It goes from, hey, I don't know what a business process looks like, to, oh, this looks a lot like that other process I've done before, and so I'm gonna document it that way.
And even with the checklist, if you don't have a set of instructions for how to complete the checklist, and those instructions might have some expectations, like the checklist needs to complete it within 1 hour of a call, or the checklist needs to be submitted at the end of every day or at the end of every week. If you don't have those, then how can you really expect your people to complete checklists effectively? They don't know how to. They could always say, well, I know we have a checklist, I just don't know how to do it. So, you really even need work plans for how to complete a checklist. And this is how processes get more detailed, and they get deeper and deeper. And when you first start out, you might just create a checklist, and then you have a frustration because the guys aren't submitting their checklists on time. So then you create a work plan that's related to getting in the checklists on time, and you train them in that. And then you find out that some guys are completing their checklist one way and other guys are doing it another way. And then you realize, oh, I don't have any instructions on how to complete the checklist. So you write those. And it just, you just accumulate all the elements of these processes. And then you get down to this place where you go, wow, how did I ever get all of this? How did I get this done? This is so cool. I've got it so dialed in.
Amazing.
It's very much a process,
Well, so I just admitted that, I was designing these processes, and I was leaving out that very critical step to actually assign it, and so I was losing the chance to ever have this complete functional accountability that you said. And you just made a good point that I think a lot of us, another mistake that we make, that we assume that everybody knows what we know, and we take a checklist without instructions and we put it out there. Are there other common mistakes you see people make in business when they're trying to document these processes?
Well, yeah. One mistake I see happen is that people, I really recommend that they hire someone to guide them through the process of business systemization. I mean, it's not rocket science to do this, and we actually teach a lot of our affiliates and a lot of our consultants how to do that so that they can do it, because some people just don't know how to think systematically. And now there is a way, there's a methodology. When you're writing a process, the first thing you want to ask is, how does this process start? And I will, like, let's say you have a customer complaint system, and you say, well, how does this process start? And some business owners, they can't answer that question. And I just keep asking it. And finally they say, well, damn it, the client calls. And I go, great. Receive a call from a client, a disgruntled client. And then what happens? And all of a sudden they start breaking it down, and they go step by step through the process. And that's always the first thing to write a process, is just say, how does it start? So, a customer complaints process starts with the customer calling and being upset. And the next step is listen and document their complaint. And the next step might be look up their order to see if we goofed. Was it a warranty claim, or is it still on warranty? And then you just go through, and you just you scope it out. And in fact, the way we do this is there's almost like the 50,000 foot view, where You just broad stroke the steps, and then we typically recommend that you schedule a little time to go in and fill in a little bit more detail. So I might have an idea to write a customer complaint system, and I'll just take 5 minutes and I'll go bang, 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 bang. And then I'll say, you know what, on Friday at noon, I'm going to sit down and spend 20 minutes just putting in some more detail. And that might be all I do. And then when I start training my guys on the customer complaint system, when we're sort of boots on the ground level, I realize, wow, I made some assumptions, because they're asking me all these great questions. Well, what do I do if I do that? And what happens if this happens? And then we just fill it in together. And gradually the process develops. So it can be very simple. I think the most important thing is keep it simple. Just keep it super simple. We're not writing software here. We're teaching human beings how to follow instructions. It's really simple.
Yeah, that was powerful. And you reminded me of some of the problems that I've run into when I've been trying to get especially my younger staff. When younger staff comes on and I'm talking about how to document out a process, it seems to be the same problem as when I see them write emails. And there's this thinking that everything has to be very official and in very business terms. And so they write these horrible emails that, are impossible to read, not because they're not thinking clear, but because they don't want the language to be too simple. They want to almost like demonstrate their, that they can articulate themselves in a business manner. And so that reminded me, or I was reminded of that when you mentioned a customer calls. That's a real life event. And I think that a lot of people are intimidated by this because they think they can't use language like a customer calls, and if they say this, then this is what we do. And that's as simple as it needs to be to get started, right?
Yeah, just keep it simple. I mean, if you've ever written programmer code, if you say like, take a sip of water. So there's a glass of water on the table. You can tell someone, take a sip of water, and they know, well, I put my hand forward, I grasp the glass, I pick it up, I put it to my lips, I take a sip of water. You don't have to write all that stuff down. A human being knows it. Keep it simple. We're not writing code. We're writing instructions for people. Simpler the better.
Excellent. Well, Michael, I know I've learned a lot. I've taken a lot of notes. I really appreciate it. So much of this is actually in line with some of the things that I have been trying to convince people to do and that I've been preaching, but you do such a great job of articulating it and telling a story in a way that I think people really get it. So I certainly appreciate that. As you know, we like to end each of these podcasts with a challenge because you can learn all you want to, and I know I'm guilty of that, but unless you're putting things on paper and taking action, then things don't, you don't necessarily don't necessarily become any better because of it. So what kind of challenge would you issue to somebody who's listening, whether it's a business owner, a marketing director, a sales manager, someone who's heard this and you've clearly hit a nerve with them and they're thinking, I need to get this stuff on paper. What's your challenge for them?
So let me give two challenges, one a little more sophisticated and one not so sophisticated. One that's going to take a little bit longer and one's going to be really super simple. The first one, you know how I went through this whole idea of saying, what are our sales processes? What are our lead generation processes? My challenge would be to start naming your processes. And Jeremy, if we give them that book, How to Systemize Your Business, I take people through this process. I even give them templates to names of to different processes in each of their key functions. But I would like to challenge anybody to map out their processes. It shouldn't take more than 2 to 4 hours. When they get at the end of this, they will have this incredible experience of seeing their business in terms, almost like a blueprint of their processes. It takes all the mystery out of the business and really just dials it down to almost like an architectural plan of what their business is. So that's the more complicated challenge. The less complicated challenge, write a telephone answering system. And in fact, I did a piece, a very short webinar on this recently on just a telephone answering system. So how do you want your telephone answered at work? And it begins with a script. And I actually even have a really super simple template that I can send people if they're interested, and then they can just edit it. But it's a great experience of how to answer the phone. I mean, you might think, what do you mean, a telephone answering system? Well, at our company, when someone answers the phone, they say, "Thank you for calling Business Design Corporation. My name is Michael Mills. How may I help you?" And that's how people answer the phone. And you should call in, block your caller ID or something, and call into your company a couple of times and find out how do people answer the phone. And if you want consistency, and we really believe that consistency is key, because it really gives the client this sense of being in control and giving them what they want, giving them what they expect, then, even something as simple as the telephone answering system makes a difference. It really does make a difference.
Brilliant. I absolutely agree. I know I have a very specific way that I want everyone to answer the phone, and I don't do a good enough job of communicating that. And so what I do is I sit there in the office and I hear other people answer the phone, and I cringe. And I'm going to systematize that, and I'm going to fix that. So
Yeah, give
really
them a script. Give them a script. And you know what? You should also have holiday messages and busy greetings that are all consistent throughout the organization, so that when you go away on holidays, you don't have to record your holiday greetings 7 times because you kept screwing it up every time. We've got that scripted. So when I go away for vacation, I just go to my Touchstone application, I pull up the holiday script, and I read it to and then I'm gone. I'm off.
And it's one less decision that you have to make, right?
It is one less decision, and it happens just like that. Instead of the stress of getting out of the office, going on vacation, and having to record that stupid thing 7 times.
Yeah, I want to point out too that you use this term script, which can sound so official to people, right? And they're like, "What do you mean a script?" But you essentially have a sentence with a couple variables, the name, a single variable, and that's it.
Yeah,
but by writing it down, everybody knows what it is. And I think another problem that I've been guilty of, that I think a lot of people might be, is you say, "Oh, that's too simple to write down. There's no point in writing that down," right? But here I am, a living example, with that not being followed in my company because I didn't write it down. So
yeah.
I think there's a real nugget of wisdom in there, that everything should be documented like that.
Yeah, if it's not written down, you don't own it. That's a classic E-Myth saying. If you don't have it written down, you don't own it.
So, well, I think that's a perfect spot to leave off. So, Michael, I really appreciate the time and all the information that you've been generous enough to share with everybody, and look forward to having you back in the future.
Great. I really appreciate you taking the time, Jeremy. It's been great to be here. Thank you.